Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the 2022 governor's map based on the latest polls. We now finally have nominees in every single one of these races. Yesterday we took a look at the Senate elections, but today we will be analyzing the gubernatorial ones. And so if we do look at this map, it is very different from the Senate map. We have incumbents in different states for different parties. Kansas, Wisconsin, we have Democratic incumbents, and of course in Arizona as well as Florida, these are states that Republicans currently control. And so a lot really has changed for the gubernatorial elections in the last couple of months. Of course, Roe v. Wade was the big issue, and it is helping Democrats overall. You can see it in these special elections for many of the House districts, New York's 19th or the 1st District of Minnesota. Democrats severely overperformed expectations because they made abortion rights an issue in their campaigns, even though, in states like Minnesota and New York, abortion rights are probably going to be protected anyways. So looking at these governor races, we are seeing an uptick of support for the Democratic nominees, and of course, Joe Biden's approval rating going up is also boosting his candidate. And so I'm going to start off with Florida, where currently we have a pretty interesting race between Ron DeSantis and Charlie Crist, and then I'm going to move on to the Midwest and then the western half of the U.S. I typically talk about Florida last, but in this video I do want to start off with the Sunshine State. Currently, Ron DeSantis is, of course, running for a second term, and he is the front runner right now to win the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. But if he ever wants to become the next president of the United States, he's going to have to defeat Charlie Crist, who is the former governor elected in 2006 as a Republican. Charlie Crist, though, in the last decade since he left the party, really has not been doing so well in major statewide races. In 2010, he ran as an independent for the Senate seat and lost to Marco Rubio, and then he lost to Rick Scott in 2014 for the governorship as the Democratic nominee, and then, of course, in that race, he lost by 1%. So Charlie Crist is not that terrible of a candidate, but he does have a track record of losing if he is not a Republican. So if we do look at the latest polls here, Ron DeSantis has led in every single poll, basically, against Charlie Crist. You'd have to go back all the way back to May to find a poll where Crist led by 1%. But basically, even a poll by the Democratic Governor Association put Ron DeSantis up by 5%. So on average, DeSantis maintains a 6.6% lead, and that is going to make Florida a likely state. I think Charlie Crist is somebody that will make this race very competitive, and Ron DeSantis knows this. He won a very narrow election in 2018. This was the closest election of the cycle, winning by just 0.39% against Andrew Gillum. So in Florida, we have a very competitive race ahead of us, but Ron DeSantis is still the heavy favorite, so Florida right now is going to be likely for the GOP. Next up in Georgia, Brian Kemp is also running for re-election. Stacey Abrams is the Democratic nominee. We have another very high-profile race with some pretty well-known nominees. Brian Kemp, of course, defeated Stacey Abrams in the 2018 election, winning by a margin of 1.4%. This was one of the closest elections of the year, and one of the best results for a Democrat in a Georgia gubernatorial election in decades. Georgia, of course, has a very long history of being a Republican state, and so Stacey Abrams getting within 2% of defeating Brian Kemp before the Democratic wins in 2020 really was a big deal. And of course, Stacey Abrams is by far the best person the Democrats could have chosen, but in this rematch, Stacey Abrams simply is not doing as well as she did previously. In 2018, she was leading in many of the polls for that race. If you do look at the final polls for that election, you will see that Stacey Abrams was much more competitive than she is right now. And on top of that, if you look at the 2022 Senate race that we have in Georgia, Raphael Warnock leads over Herschel Walker by 1.8%. So Republicans are not doing that badly in Georgia. It simply is Herschel Walker in the Senate race. So on the gubernatorial level, we're not going to see a Democratic win most likely. Brian Kemp is pretty secure in terms of winning a second term. He has the support of Republican voters. He destroyed David Perdue, despite Brian Kemp not allowing Donald Trump to overturn the presidential election results in his state. So Georgia is also going to be a likely Republican state, but just barely according to the polls right now. And now we're going to move on to the most competitive region in the entire country. That, of course, is the upper Midwest. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These four states made up the blue wall that is really starting to crumble. In the last couple of elections, these four states have become closer than they have been in almost half a century. If you look at these four states going all the way back to the 1990s, they were consistently won by Democratic candidates, but right now, the blue wall really could go both ways. So I'm going to start off with the election that we have in Minnesota. Tim Walz is running for a second term, and he is pretty secure in his position. Tim Walz does have a pretty good chance at winning re-election. According to 538, he has a 90% chance at defeating Scott Jensen, and if you look at the polls, even Scott Jensen's own campaign poll put Tim Walz ahead by 4%. We also saw a previous poll from June that had Walz up by 2, so we're not going to see a flip in Minnesota most likely. I think that if Democrats can't even win in Minnesota, they don't stand a chance in Wisconsin or maybe even Michigan and Pennsylvania. So right now, Minnesota is going to be a likely Democratic state as Tim Walz leads on average by a margin of 3%. Next up, in neighboring Wisconsin, Tony Evers is running for his re-election. He defeated Scott Walker, the incoming two-term governor, in 2018 by a margin of 1.1%. It was a pretty impressive flip for the Democratic Party. Of course, the national environment was much more favorable to them, but Tony Evers defeating a two-term incumbent running for his third term was a pretty impressive feat. And so if you do look at the race this year, Tony Evers is still in a pretty good position. The most recent Fox News poll has him leading by 3% against Tim Michels. Tim Michels is the Republican nominee. He narrowly defeated Rebecca Cleaver's the lieutenant governor under Scott Walker. And so if you look at the latest 530 forecast for this race, Tony Evers actually has a 66% chance at winning re-election. I think this is surprisingly high. I don't think he has this good of a chance, and I don't think Tony Evers is going to win by a larger margin than he did in 2018. I think Wisconsin is going to be one of the most competitive elections that we have. I really could see it going both ways. Tony Evers as a Democrat with a Democrat in the White House is very, very vulnerable. No Democrat has won a Wisconsin gubernatorial election with a Democratic president in office since all the way back in 1962, and that was when JFK was still alive and the president of the United States. So you have to go back all the way 60 years to find the last time in which a Democratic president oversaw the win of a Democratic gubernatorial candidate in Wisconsin. So right now, I do have it as lean according to the polls, but I do think Wisconsin really could go both ways. It is going to be one of the most exciting races that we have on the ballot this November, but with the incumbency, Democrats have a better chance than they would without it. And in the state of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer leads by 11.3% against Tudor Dixon. Yes, if you do look at this graph as a whole, it is not good for Gretchen Whitmer, but you do have to consider the fact that at this point in time, Tudor Dixon was a pretty much unknown candidate to the entire country, and of course their own state of Michigan. She narrowly won the Republican primary with around 40% of the vote after James Craig was disqualified. And if you do look at the most recent numbers, we are seeing the race starting to tighten up, and that was the natural result of Dixon finally winning the Republican nomination. However, the most recent Trafalgar poll has Gretchen Whitmer leading by 4%. If Trafalgar has a Democrat leading by 4%, they're basically guaranteed to win. Gretchen Whitmer right now is in a very good position. She is very strong. She won by 10% in 2018 to her first term, and in 2022, if any of these Midwestern governors win, it is going to be Gretchen Whitmer first. I think she has a better chance than even Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. So Gretchen Whitmer right now is looking pretty good in her election. If you look at the 538 forecast, she has a 91% chance at winning her election, even higher than the chances for Tim Walz in Minnesota, which is much bluer of the state, voted for Joe Biden by 5 more points to the left. So in Michigan, I'm going to categorize it currently as likely, but in the end, I do think the margin is going to be more likely, and I think a 4 to 5% margin is very likely for Whitmer, and the polls right now currently have her up by 11.3%, but I do expect the polls to close in a little bit as election day approaches, but that is not something that's supposed to be worrying for the Democratic Party. We are going to see this race become more competitive simply because Tudor Dixon is going to be more well known to voters in her state. And the final state we have in the Midwest is Pennsylvania. This is the election between Josh Shapiro and Doug Mastriano. By far, Doug Mastriano is the worst Republican nominee for any governor election this year. On the Senate level, I think that Herschel Walker and Mehmet Oz are in a pretty close tie, but in the governor elections, Doug Mastriano is by far the worst one. The Republican Governor Association has not even endorsed Mastriano, and he was nominated over 3 months ago. So if you do look at every single poll, Josh Shapiro has been leading. The most recent Emerson College poll does put Shapiro up by 3, but Emerson does like to skew results a little bit in favor of Republicans, and even the most recent Trafalgar Group poll has Shapiro up by 4%. So Josh Shapiro is almost guaranteed to win this election. It really is going to come down to what margin it's going to be. I think Mastriano can get within 3 to 4% because in the end, Democrats are going to underperform expectations in Pennsylvania. There's no way Josh Shapiro is going to win by 7.3%, but according to the polls right now, it is going to be likely. I think we're going to see similar races in both Pennsylvania and Michigan. Yes, in 2018, we saw a very good showing for Democrats in the Midwest after Hillary Clinton lost them in 2016. Pennsylvania, of course, was solid for Tom Wolf against Scott Wagner, but this time around, we're just not going to see the same thing. Democrats are simply not as powerful as they were 4 years ago when Donald Trump was in office. And if you look at the 530 forecast, Josh Shapiro has an 84% chance of winning. So I do think this race is almost guaranteed to go to the Democratic Party, but not by the margins that polls currently suggest. And moving on to the Northeast, we only have one competitive election here, and that is the race in Maine between Janet Mills and Paula Page. Paula Page is the former governor elected in 2010 and 2014. Janet Mills won the Democratic nomination and won the governorship in 2018 and is now running for re-election. So we have two governors running against each other. Paula Page does stand a chance in this race. I think that 530 vastly underestimates the Republican nominee. Janet Mills has an 82% chance at winning according to this forecast. I simply do not think that is realistic. I think Maine is much more competitive than the polls make it out to be. I mean, a 4 and 5% margin, I mean, that's not really too much for Democratic candidates in Maine. Democrats do underperform in this state. Of course, if we look at the 2020 Senate election between Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins won by 10% despite being expected to lose by almost the same margin to Gideon. So we're going to have to keep a close eye on the Maine gubernatorial race, but right now Paula Page does have a pretty clear advantage according to the polls, despite these polls being pretty old from all the way back in April and May. So on this map, according to the polls, I'm going to fill in the state of Maine as a lean Democratic state. And most of these states are going to be lean for the Democratic Party, especially in the western half of the United States. And so now I'm going to look at the polls in Texas, move up to Kansas, and then the other four races that we have left. So in the state of Texas, we have the election between Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke. Abbott, on average, leads by 8.9%. Beto O'Rourke is, of course, famous for almost defeating Ted Cruz in the 2018 Senate election, coming within 3% of defeating the Republican incumbent. And Ted Cruz is not that strong of a candidate, not nearly as strong as Greg Abbott, and that is why Beto O'Rourke is going to struggle this time around. And Texans really do not want a Democratic governor. I think that Democrats could not have chosen a better candidate, but Beto O'Rourke is not going to be enough for them to flip this governor's mansion. Greg Abbott has led in every single poll that's been released. In 2018, he won re-election to a second term by almost a solid margin, and he won his first election in 2014. So Greg Abbott is pretty solid in his position right now. 538 currently categorizes Texas as a solid Democratic state, with Greg Abbott having a solid Republican state, with Greg Abbott having a 95% chance at winning his third term. Abbott is a pretty popular governor as well, despite his many failures in the last couple of years. Of course, the main one being the shutdown of the Texas power grid during that whole blizzard a couple of years ago. So, that is far behind voters' minds right now in the state, and so that is why Beto O'Rourke really is not going to end up being the winner here. Texas, according to the polls and also by projections, is going to be a likely state for the Republican Party. Next up in Kansas, we have the election between Laura Kelly and Derek Schmidt. Laura Kelly has a much better chance than even Beto O'Rourke in Texas as the incumbent Democratic governor. She was elected in 2018 by 5 percentage points against Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach was a horrible candidate on the GOP side, and that just really goes to show you just how much candidate quality can matter even in a state like Kansas. And if you look at this election, Laura Kelly is down by 3% if you take a look at this poll by face value, but it was sponsored by a Republican partisan sponsor, so that is going to have an effect on these polling numbers. The John Brown Freedom Fund is, of course, a sponsor for the GOP, and so right now I think that this race is pretty even. I would say it is tilted Republican in my opinion, simply because of the national environment, but Laura Kelly is still very much in this race. 530 actually favors Kelly over Schmidt. Derek Schmidt is the current Attorney General of the state, and Laura Kelly right now has a 53% chance at winning this election. The odds have gone up for her quite significantly over the last couple of months, but it's always been a pretty close race, and currently Laura Kelly is expected to win by 0.6%, so much closer than her 2018 race. And so according to the polls right now, Kansas is going to be lean for the Republican Party, but is definitely not out of the reach of the Democratic Party. Instead, we're going to take a look at the polls starting off with Oregon, then Nevada, Arizona, and finish off with New Mexico. So in Oregon, Democrats lead by 4.5% on average. Tina Kotek is the Democratic nominee. She's running a three-way race against Christine Drazan and Betsy Johnson. She is running as an independent, but was a former Democrat when she represented a district for the state Senate. So looking at the latest numbers here, Christine Drazan does lead by 1% according to the latest Republican-funded poll all the way back in June, but Tina Kotek led by 3 in a Betsy Johnson funded poll, and Christine Drazan was only in 3rd place according to that one. So Betsy Johnson and Tina Kotek are going to split the Liberal vote in Oregon. Without Johnson, it would be a pretty solid race with Kotek. Kotek is not that strong of a nominee, that's why Betsy Johnson is doing so well, but in the end, independents almost always do worse than expected, and so that's why Tina Kotek is still probably going to win the governor election. I think a lean rating for Oregon is pretty accurate at this point. Kate Brown is the Democratic incumbent. She's pretty unpopular in 2018. She only won re-election by 6.4%, and I mean, this was 2018 in Oregon. This should be a very solid race for Democrats 4 years ago, but right now it is only going to be a lean Democratic state. That just goes to show you how unpopular Kate Brown was, that so many voters are trying to not vote for the Democratic candidate, but Tina Kotek, simply because of how blue Oregon is still in a very good position overall. In the state of Nevada, Steve Sisolak is running for his re-election. Joe Lombardo is the Republican nominee. Sisolak is running in a very close election. I think that on the Senate level, the Nevada race is going to be the closest one, but in the gubernatorial race here in Nevada, I think Steve Sisolak is preferred to win by quite a bit. According to 538, he has a 63% chance at winning re-election. He's led in basically every single poll against Lombardo. If you do look at the latest numbers, only the most recent Trafalgar poll has Lombardo leading by 3, and in 2018, Trafalgar was pretty far off in terms of the gubernatorial polls that they conducted when Steve Sisolak defeated Adam Laxalt. Yes, the same Adam Laxalt that is now running for the Senate against Masto. So Steve Sisolak is actually underperforming Catherine Cortez Masto right now, but that is not what the trend has been overall. I think that in the very end, Catherine Cortez Masto is still going to be in a more competitive race than Steve Sisolak, even though the polls do not suggest this. But right now, Nevada is going to be a lean Democratic state based on the numbers that we're seeing, and basically is what we're going to see in the remaining 2 races as well in Arizona and New Mexico. And as you can see here in Arizona, Katie Hobbs leads by 3.3% against Kari Lake, 47 to 43.8. Looking at the numbers, Katie Hobbs has led in every single poll against Kari Lake in the last couple of months. Kari Lake did perform pretty badly against Katie Hobbs compared to Karen Taylor Robson, who lost the Republican nomination pretty narrowly to the Trump-backed Lake. Kari Lake is a pretty well-known TV anchor in Arizona. Karen Taylor Robson was supported by Doug Ducey and Mike Pence, so we had a very competitive primary that Kari Lake did come out on top of, but she is going to have to unite her party. Katie Hobbs won a much larger majority of the Democratic nomination. She's the current Secretary of State and had a role in blocking Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the presidential election in Arizona. So Katie Hobbs on average leads by 3.3%, and 538 does have Arizona as a toss-up state. I really think it could go both ways. In 2018, Doug Ducey won his re-election by 14.2%. He cannot run for a 3rd term, and even if he did, he would have faced a pretty tough primary challenge from the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Trump and Ducey got along pretty well for a very long time, but after Ducey also refused to overturn the 2020 election results in Arizona, Trump basically turned on him and has been attacking Ducey for quite a while now. So Doug Ducey's career is basically over in the Republican Party, but Katie Hobbs and Kari Lake are in a very tough race right now, and Doug Ducey has yet to even endorse Kari Lake. I believe Ducey actually said that he would not endorse any candidate for this race, and so that is worrying for the GOP. I mean, even prominent Republicans know that their candidates are not the strongest to win in 2022. That is why they're doing so poorly. If you had generic Democrats and generic Republicans running these races, I think Republicans should by far win more races than the Democrats. If you look at just the competitive states, right now Arizona is actually going to be lean for the Democratic Party based on the polls. And finally, in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham is one of the worst nominees on the Democratic side, and Mark Ronchetti is actually one of the better Republican nominees. He came very close to defeating Ben Lujan in 2020. It was around a 4 to 5% margin, yes, but Mark Ronchetti was expected to lose by double digits, so he's one of the best Republicans that they have nominated this year. Michelle Lujan Grisham is one of the most unpopular governors in the country, and even has sexual assault allegations against her. So in 2018, she might have won by 14%, but this election is going to be much closer, and we're going to see a significant shift to the right in New Mexico, even though it is a very blue state. 538, though, does disagree with me here. They do give Michelle Lujan Grisham a 79% chance to win, but 538 does tend to overestimate Democrats significantly in more Democratic states, even though if their candidates are pretty bad. So in New Mexico, I do have it as a lean rating personally, and the polls seem to agree with me on that as well. So this is the 2022 governor's map based on the latest polls. We have 3 flips for Democrats in Maryland, Massachusetts, and Arizona, and 1 flip for the GOP in Kansas, and so this makes it so the Democrats would have a net gain of 2 seats after these midterms. And so, of course, I don't think this is actually going to happen. I think Democrats are going to do a tiny bit worse. But if you do look at the big picture, Republicans are not where they need to be to have a successful midterm year. Democrats are outperforming expectations overall. Even if they underperform in many states, they're not going to do as badly as they did in 2014, where they only won 18 governorships. And of course, in 2018, they won a total of 23. So we're probably going to see a pretty stagnant amount of governorships for both parties after these midterms. And so that'll be it for this video. Make sure to like it down below if you're joining. Comment down below which party you think will win more governorships, and do you think the polls are going to be accurate in these competitive states? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Consider purchasing a channel membership for just 99 cents per month as we enter the last 2 months until the midterms in November. Again, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more midterm updates, and I'll see you guys in the next video.